Well, it's my great pleasure, and I'm incredibly proud, actually. I get to do quite a few amazing events, but this is the one that really means something. I almost feel like we should start drinking right now. It's been quite the journey with this exhibition, so I'm really glad to be with fellow scholars and thought leaders for the Richardson Symposium about 1898 US Imperial Visions and Revisions. This is the first major Smithsonian Museum exhibition to examine the War of 1898, often called the Spanish-American War, the Congressional Joint Resolution to annex Hawaii in July of 1898, the Philippine-American War that went from 1899 to 1913, and the legacy of this controversial chapter in history. And we're doing it through the lens of portraiture and visual culture. The exhibition presents the perspectives of those who advocated for the overseas expansion, those who opposed it, and those who tried to have agency over their political futures when the United States brought Cuba, Guam, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines into its sphere of power. I want to start by a giant shout out to the two co-curators, Taina Catagol and Kate Clark LeMay. I was actually, in preparing my remarks this morning, I was looking at my director's exhibition review comments dated August the 21st, 2016. And it said, this is what I said was the first part of my, what turned out to be a 3-page reply. This is exactly the type of show we need to do more of. History-based, little known or largely forgotten periods of American development, and introducing people whose decisions back then still resonate so strongly today. Well, little did any of us know. A year later, Hurricane Maria would hit Puerto Rico, and the then President of the United States suggested that it had actually caused the federal budget to go out of whack. In that same year, there was talks of closing the embassy in Cuba. And there's been a litany since then, but of course last May we had the typhoon in Guam, and our hearts still go to the people there of Guam who are dealing with the aftermath of that. And of course today the fires in Maui, including the growing militarization around the Philippines and all the talks around international diplomacy and our relationship with China and other nations. There's so much that has happened in that time when I was, and the curators were thinking about the exhibition to today, that we could probably be in this auditorium for a month. And indeed, the acknowledgements run to about 6 pages in the book. So it's my happy pleasure too. I do also mention that Taina and Kate were joined by Carolina Maestra, who was our former, back then, curatorial assistant for Latino art and history, so thanks to her as well. There were a lot of setbacks and complexities to this exhibition. We actually delayed it at least twice. I think it might even have been 3 times. I lost count, partly because we knew that the more that we didn't know, the more we didn't know, and the curatorial team travelled to 74 collections. We ended up borrowing 90 objects. Then there was the pandemic that didn't help any, and we were closed for a period of time. And of course, the extended travel and the conservation. There were so many questions for us internally as an institution too about our own cultural biases. We realised that we had always really centred American history and portraiture and identity on this continent of the United States, and some would argue very much East Coast based. And all of that, and including questions about language justice and who were we leaving out of the picture, had many, many hours of really important debate. And I know that all of you who are scholars, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, because you really were the resource for us. I will tell you that I want to thank the people who made the exhibition possible. You know, that everyone in the portrait gallery got involved in this, absolutely everybody. But the team who I really have to thank dearly are the Advancement Office, because when I told them that we had to raise $1.7 million for an exhibition on 1898, their faces just went wide. And they're like, oh, what? And who now? And they really were extraordinary because I said, we can do this. Sure, not a lot of people, are aware of the impact of this period of history, and it hasn't always, let's say, been celebratory. And we're probably the only ones who are doing it, and I think it's true, and the 125th anniversary of the conflict of that year, I believe we're the only institution to be actually talking about it. So, when I say the thanks to the supporters, I'm really thankful. We couldn't have done it. And one of the first actually was Sam and Ann Menkoff. Sam is on my board. And he had a lot of reservations, as did the commissioners. They're like, why are we doing this, Kim? Like, explain to us. Could you have picked anything more challenging? And I'm like, I don't know. I could probably think of a few. But, And they came through with a lead gift. And then right after that, and I can't say how grateful I was the Mellon Foundation, was our first major grant. When you get a Mellon Foundation grant, you get that stamp of approval and you get that blessing. I was just like, yes, this is going to work. Then we got the support from the Terra Foundation, Luis Miranda. I still remember calling Luis. I'm like, I really need your help. And he said, okay. So Luis Miranda and the Miranda Family Foundation. The Bank of America, actually, they didn't give us funding, but they gave funding to the National Archives of Hawaii to restore the magnificent portrait of Queen Liliuokalani that you see in the gallery. Then we have Kate Kelly and George Schweitzer, M. Salamai Gali, Duany McLaughlin, Gretchen Sierra Zorita, and Peter Hutt. And then the late Anne Roulet and Laura Roulet and Rafael Hernandez, who I believe are here with us today. I particularly want to thank our colleagues at the Latino Initiatives Pool that's now administered by the National Museum of the American Latino. Since we started, we now have a new museum that we are trying to build. And they came through with incredibly important early money, and I'm so appreciative. And also the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. Our colleagues have been behind us the whole way, and I'm so appreciative. So the book, which was delayed because it had 2 peer reviews, we knew, and I should say that we have this system in the Smithsonian where you have to sort of front up whether you think there'll be any challenges in the press. We had 3 reviews. So we've had a lot of discussions because I think we can all agree history is being politicized in a way that we've never quite experienced it in our lifetimes before. And so the book is done by Princeton University Press, and they've been amazing partners. We also got funding from the Kaplan Foundation and Fred Levin and the Jansen Foundation in memory of Nancy Livingston Levin. The ambitious publication is really the result of collaborative work with many outside scholars, and some of those are here today. I'd like to thank George Duany, Kristen Hoganson, Loa Johnson, Paul Kramer, Theo Gonzalez, excuse me with my New Jersey accent, David Aona Chang, Silvia Álvarez Curbelo, and Lanny Thompson, Brian McAllister Lynn, and Neil Ware for their work as contributors or reviewers on the catalogue. And again, apologies if I've got the nomenclature wrong. I also particularly want to thank our publications team of Reese Conlon and Sarah McGavran, as well as Alison Kielman and Carolina Maestra, again, for getting the book to its final publication. We had early copies sent and they are available in the store. They're going out to our board today. So the symposia, I want to thank the Barra Foundation and the family of the late Edgar P. Richardson for their generous support. And of course, as I mentioned to the staff, it's been incredibly, it's been a group effort. We also have Claudia Gonzalez-Diaz and Maria Judith Feliciano to thank for their interpretation services, and Andrew Hurley for his translation services. So the show is up until February the 25th of next year. There's a comprehensive website with an equally comprehensive bibliography online. There are Smartify audio tours. There's a lot going on, and I know that I've rabbited on a little bit far, but just from a heartfelt perspective, I was talking to one of my commissioners and I said, look, we have this symposium, we have this, incredible interest, and I've been gripping piece of wood since the show opened, and I think I will until February the 26th to see what will happen and what the reaction will be given the current political moment we're in. But I got to tell you, when that double-page spread came out in the Washington Post, I was so happy. And I keep waiting to see what is going to be the reaction from different communities, different writers, different scholars. I know that we all have a lot to learn, and none of this is easy, but I truly believe that we are a museum of people, by people, and for people. And the only way we can approach the future and have a hope for our children is through people. Technology is not going to do it. So we have to come together, we have to build community like we've never done it before, and it doesn't mean that we all agree with each other. It means that we actually sit down and we talk about what binds us and what divides us, and how, what do we care about going forward. And this is an opportunity to bring a community together to talk about some real, wounds from the past. But I hope also think about how can we go forward for the sake of the future of our next generations. So it's my great pleasure to ask the panelists coming for the history of 1898, the roundtable, to come up to the stage. And thank you again from the bottom of my heart.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, and I want to thank the co-curators, Kate and Taina, for inviting me. So we are ready. Well, actually, I think we're on time, a little bit behind. We have a full roundtable, as you can see, 4 speakers and myself, but my role will be simply to take turns and tell them to keep to their time. I will only mention their names and their affiliations. The short bios are in your packet so you can read them. So my name is Jorge Duany. I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University, and I'm also a professor of anthropology there. Ambeth Ocampo, who is second to my left, professor of history at the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines. And Hattori, also to my left, a professor of Pacific history at the University of Guam. Silvia Álvarez Curbelo, next to them, a retired professor of communications at the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras. And finally, Adam Jansen he's a state archivist of Hawaii. So the way this roundtable was set up, they asked us not to present papers, which of course is almost impossible for academics, but I'm sure they prepared some remarks. They asked us to discuss some key questions, big questions, before we go into the individual topics, and then of course we'll be able to see the exhibit. And so I came up with 4 major questions that I sent the speakers some time ago in July. They don't have to answer all of the questions, and if they take too long, we're going to have to move on to the next one. But these are the questions, and I hope that you'll appreciate they're, again, designed to be general as well as specific, so that each one of them can focus on the country or the actors or the social processes that they prefer. So the first question is sort of very broad. And it's this: what were the main geopolitical and economic motives that led to the military intervention of the United States in the war between Cuba and Spain in 1898? Number 2, how did the aftermath of the Spanish-American War transform the United States and its newly acquired territories? Number 3, what were the long-term political, economic, and cultural repercussions of the war for the United States, as well as for Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, together with Hawaii? And finally, if we can get to that topic, how did ordinary residents of these islands cope with the growing presence of the United States in all walks of life? So those are the 4 major questions. We'll see how we can do. Each one of the speakers has up to 10 minutes. I know somebody will be telling us how we're doing with time, and we hope that we'll be able to open up for discussion afterwards. So our first speaker to follow the order of the program will be Ambeth Ocampo.
All the questions will actually take 3 semesters to cover, and I only have 10 minutes. So I want to just give a story of what what I did this week. I arrived on Sunday around midday, and my hotel room was not available until 4 o'clock. So I decided to take an aimless walk down to the Smithsonian Museums. And walking there, I passed our embassy on Massachusetts and found out that you had to go through a roundabout with two interconnecting streets, one called Corregidor and the other Bataan, which are place names which are connected to the Second World War. So I walked further down, went to the White House, take the obligatory selfie, and I walked to my right to the Eisenhower building. And the Philippine connection there is that Eisenhower, before he became president, served in the Philippines under Douglas MacArthur from 1935 to 39. I also remember that he was not the only U.S. president who served in Manila. William Howard Taft also served there, and we are told that entertaining in the White House changed a great deal, like they had garden parties, which were things that Taft learned when he was in Manila. So these things started to come out. And while I was looking at this building, I remembered that it used to house the State, Army, and War departments, which figure in 1898 and the Spanish-American War. There are two cannons outside this building that were taken by George Dewey during after the battle for Manila Bay in May 1, 1898. And so these things showed me that there are so much traces of Philippine history in the U.S. Capitol that lie in plain sight, but only for those who know or who seek them out. I then remembered that these cannons were used in the famous battle for Manila, 1898, and it should remind people that the first shot in the Spanish-American War did not happen anywhere close to Washington or Madrid. It happened half the world away in Manila Bay. And yet this is something that is invisible in most histories and in much of people's memories. When I went to the Museum of American History, of course, I spent a lot of time in the Julia Child exhibit. But then I saw an exhibit on Hispanic America. There was a show called What Makes US, What Makes Us. And there was a display on Hispanic, Chinese, Indian, Middle Eastern immigration to the United States. And there was no mention of the Philippines at all. We were only represented by a replica of what is called a balikbayan box. It's a care box that Filipinos in the US fill up with spam and send to the Philippines. So I started to ask, why is the Philippines and the Filipinos invisible here, even if we are the fourth largest immigrant community after Mexicans, Chinese, and Indians? And I'd like to think that part of it lies in the way that the Spanish-American War has been presented and represented in the last 125 years. This winter, I taught a Philippine history course in the University of Michigan, and I was surprised when we got to the Spanish-American War that many of my students, American students, sort of realized that 1898 is a blip in their long history, and only a handful actually knew the details of the war and knew about the Philippine-American War. And this was not because of their textbooks, it was because their teachers actually took the time to talk about them. So when I started a history career in public history 35 years ago, it was the same thing. We didn't have the Philippine-American War in our textbooks. So when I started writing about it, I would get letters to the editor saying, you're anti-American, you're a communist, and all sorts of things. No? And people didn't want to believe in the texts on the Philippine-American War, such that when the U.S. bases were being negotiated in the 80s, I came out in a documentary, talked about the war. And the documentary, unfortunately, I've appeared in 3 films. 2 of them were X-rated. One was for sexual content, this one for political content. And I was actually called to a congressional hearing where I had to explain the Philippine-American War to the censors who says, you know, America came to save us from Spain and to liberate us from the Japanese. If you treat them this way, they won't save us anymore. And I said, what history did you learn, you know? And so we have this exhibit here today, and I'm very glad because it shows that we have come a long way. But why is this detailed discussion of the Spanish-American War, Philippine-American War not in the U.S. schools? The excuse always is that there's too much material and too little time. But I'd like to think that part of the reason, which is not expressed, is that the U.S. is conflicted and conflicting about it, about the way they look at it. And so in 1999, the Library of Congress changed the subject category from Philippine insurrection to Philippine-American War. People think it's just a minor bibliographic thing, but it is significant because it shows how the U.S., in the way they represent the war, downplayed the war into an insurrection, which is just an uprising against the government, while a war is a conflict between two states. So the point here is, for the past 125 years, that war is not recognized because it goes counter to what the U.S. benevolent assimilation policy was. We are here to civilize and Christianize the Philippines, even if we were Christian for 400 years before they arrived. And also that the problem there is that if they recognized it, then it would create problems in the way in which the U.S. occupied the Philippines. So the thing here is the Filipinos had declared independence from Spain with the U.S. as their allies. We had established a government and adopted a constitution. All of that did not mean anything in the negotiations for the Spanish-American War. So the insurrection, as they called it, is a way to erase this part of history. Now, in July 1946, Emilio Aguinaldo was still alive, living relic of the Spanish-American War, and he saw the American flag come down, Philippine flag come up. And when people read it, even today, I just received an email about the U.S. granting Philippine independence in 1946. I corrected him and said, if you read the text, the U.S. recognized the independence of the Philippines. They didn't grant it at all. So Aguinaldo, who was alive at the time, said, by recognizing our independence, the U.S. has only returned what they took from us in 1898. So the point here is, I'd like to think that history is more than textbook things. It defines what we are as a people and defines how we move forward from a shared past into a shared future. So the legacy of 1898 in the Philippines today is also conflicted. And having shows like this that give us the different views and show us how this part in history has been presented and represented over time is a way for us to come to terms with the past and help us move towards the future. Thank you and good morning.
Sorry, I do have just a few slides here, so I'm assuming. But, I don't. Oh, okay, there. Okay, Hafaday, I'm from Guam, the University of Guam, and I figured that it doesn't hurt to give you a little bit of basic information because I can't assume that you've all been there. It's takes almost a day to get there, if you're lucky. Guam is a single island, so this is a very nice overview picture. It's quite small, okay, 210 square miles, only 30 miles long. So pretty much in a couple hours you can drive the island. And I wanted just to show you the map of the Pacific. So we're about 3,800 miles from Hawaii, and then another 1,500 miles to the Philippines. So, 1898, you're looking at the map like, what's the U.S. doing out there? But, at the time, they were using steamships, and the steamships needed to recoal, and so it was taken as a coaling station. And the ramifications of 1898 for Guam are profound. I mean, obviously, we had had Spanish influence since 1521, Ferdinand Magellan, officially colonized in 1600. So we'd already had, as Ambeth has said, hundreds of years of Christianity, hundreds of years of Spanish colonialism. So the United States taking over the island it's not a little thing. This is a huge change for the island. If you read Guam's history books, it's portrayed as a comical event. Like the American ships come in with all of their weapons, and the Spanish are unable to defend themselves. They had a ceremonial cannon, so they had no weapons on the island. So it's portrayed in the historiography as this sort of funny event that moves Guam forward towards progress and modernity, whereas Spain, was representing a sort of a decaying empire. So in Guam's history, and of course because Guam is still a U.S. colony and Guam is very heavily militarized, the whole story of 1898 has been remembered as a happy event, although, there is research that shows that, this was very traumatizing for the people. Many people apparently fled to their ranches in the jungles because they were afraid, right? If these armed troops land on the island, what will that mean? Other people flocked to the churches just to pray, Catholic tradition, saying their rosaries and their prayers. So, I mean, obviously, there may have been some people on Guam who were happy, but this was a very complicated event, a takeover, a hostile takeover. And prior to 1898, the main interaction that the native Chamorros had with the Americans was whaling ships. And those whalers were not the best representatives of American culture. Those were wild and rowdy guys. And there are oral histories that say, families used to say, the whaling ships are here, keep your daughters in the house. So, it wasn't exactly, the 4th of July parade. But one of the things that happened in 1898 when the U.S. took Guam, because obviously they took Guam solely for the purpose of being able to move closer to Asia, right, to the Philippines, was they took only Guam. But Guam is part of a chain of islands, the Mariana Islands. At the time, the population of Guam was 9,000. The northern islands population was only 2,600, but they only took Guam. They divided the islands. And so obviously, first of all, that tells us this had nothing to do with the people. 1898, Spanish-American War, it had nothing to do with the people. We just happened to be on the island that they wanted because of the harbor. But because they could have, if they took all the islands, it would have been only 2,600 more people. But they didn't. And so what happened was Spain went and sold the northern islands to Germany. And then after World War I, this is like very complicated world history, so this is like, 3 lectures in 10 minutes. Then after World War I, Germany loses, League of Nations transfers control to Japan, which at the time, it was okay. But then, by the 30s, Japan and the United States were enemies. So during World War II, the Chamorro people in the Northern Marianas and the Chamorro people on Guam are enemies in war, and we're fighting on opposite sides, and the animosities continue to this day. Every time the islands have talked about reunification, it always comes up, being on opposite sides of the war. Guam today, so we've had this long legacy of America using Guam for its military interests. And after World War II, the U.S., Guam was occupied by Japan, because Japan had controlled those islands. And so from Saipan, which is the largest of the northern islands, they invaded Guam. And for 2.5 years, Guam was occupied by Japan during the war. It's a very difficult, traumatic time for the Chamorros. When the war ended, their population by the time of the war was 20,000. But the United States then used our islands as part of the end of World War II. In fact, the atomic bombs that were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the planes took off from Tinian, which is just north of Guam. So the islands were so heavily militarized that we had 200,000 military on Guam in that year, right before the war ended. They took 80% of the land and 75% of the farmland. And the farmlands have not been returned. So since World War II, we've got a population that has become pretty much completely dependent on imports. There's very little farming because the farmlands were taken. Of course, the lands the military took were primarily, the choicest land, right? and not only farmlands, but the adjacent fishing grounds. So, the legacy, of course, it's very complicated on Guam as elsewhere because the island has become so dependent on the military and the U.S. economy. But, there's that reality that the presence of the U.S. has created a situation on Guam where discussions of sustainability are very difficult, because if you can't even provide your own food, it becomes difficult for the people to imagine being able to sustain themselves in any other way other than cans of Spam. Okay. Is that my time? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Oh, I still have 5 minutes? Okay, sorry. So I mean, when the United States came to Guam, and it was an agricultural community, very much Catholic, surrounded by Catholic traditions in the family. And I mean, for the most part, before World War II, that was sustained. It's really World War II was the turning point, of course, the Cold War, and then Guam becomes this military fortress. But prior to that, really, in many ways, the lifestyle had remained very consistent, with small introductions of some capitalist activity, because prior to that, it had been really subsistence economies. So, the immediate impact of 1898 wasn't as dramatic as you would think. I mean, most people were still speaking the native language, et cetera. It's just after World War II, when people lose their land and they lose their farms, they're forced into the cash economy. And at the time, this is before civil rights legislation, so Chamorros were only being paid 25 cents to the dollar of what white people were getting paid. So they were getting really very, very minimal pay for any job they could take. And so the only way to sort of get ahead in that new economy was to speak English and to Americanize. So it's just created a situation where the pathway to escape poverty was through sort of embracing this new economy, because the island was being heavily militarized and the military was hiring thousands of people. So much so that it had to start importing labor from the Philippines in order to help build up the military bases. So on Guam, there's sort of a love-hate relationship with the United States. I mean, people, like every family has members of the family who are in the military or work on base, like everyone. And they're very grateful for that. But at the same time, recognize that, okay, but they're on our land, and people were paid roughly $1 an acre for the land, which at the time, the justification was that land was not a commodity. You didn't buy and sell your land. There were no real estate agencies, because your land was your land. That's the only land you had. So it didn't have a price tag, right? There was no real estate agency. So the military said, well, there's no price, so we'll give it $1 an acre. There's your price. But this is land that had sustained people 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, the whole year, their whole family. And now that land is taken, they're given $1 an acre, and then they have to take these jobs that are paying them 25 cents an hour. It was just a very difficult situation. I think the Chamorro people became sort of the lower class, the landless and the homeless, which is a situation that is still in many ways present today. I mean, the really struggling part of the local community, of the island community, are the indigenous. So I mean, there are obviously many advantages that have come through the U.S. period, but there's also, I mean, you can't escape, the history of it, and but we do what we can, right? It's a surviving culture. And I think our culture, we have a history of being in a typhoon belt, as was mentioned. And I think that historically, for thousands of years, we've just always been a resilient culture who's used to surviving whatever disasters come their way. And this is just another thing to survive and sort of thrive through it, right? And I think there is a very strong cultural revival movement going on Guam. And it's not bleak, I'm not saying that, but there are many challenges, and some almost insurmountable, as the U.S. is considering now putting in this missile defense system and nuclear energy, and it's just piling up in some ways.
Good morning. Just a few seconds to express my sympathy for the Hawaiian people and their terrible loss in Maui, and especially to the community of Lahaina. I'm going to address mainly two of the questions that were posed by by Jorge Duany. The third one, what were the long-term political, economic, and cultural repercussions of the War of the United States, as well as for the 1898 acquired possessions, in this case, Puerto Rico. To answer this question, I will go fast forward to the pandemic years, from 1988 to the pandemic years. The pandemic experience in Puerto Rico during 2020 to 2022 was the culmination of a recent series of structural and natural disasters that hit the island in the short span of 7 years. That included the devastating Hurricane Maria in 2017. In 2020, the Census Bureau announced that Puerto Rico has lost in the past decade nearly 11.8% of its population. In fact, during the same period, all actual U.S. territories showed a dramatic loss in population. The sequence of disasters that started with the collapse of Puerto Rico's bones in 2013 and the territory's bankruptcy in 2016 condensed what many characterize as the result of the territorial syndrome, a combination of political inequality, dramatic immigration, abysmal economic disparity with the mainland, second-rate citizenship, health, and educational challenges. The experience of generalized dislocation, uncertainty, and anxiety in Puerto Rico needs to be signified within this unique socio-political historical context of territoriality. This kind of time suspension, prompted by uncertainty and waiting, influence and confusion, have been Puerto Rico's middle names in 125 years of, not solitude, well, perhaps, relationship with the United States, except for specific periods where Puerto Rico was able to forge its way, although limited, to modernization, development, and political own-will. After the 1988 war, the United States, there was an almost complete roadmap for Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii, but not for Puerto Rico. Since those early days, our country's standing within the U.S. constitutional order has been characterized by persistent ambiguity, as evidenced in the infamous insular cases, amply discussed by scholars. The insular cases are a series of opinions by the Supreme Court of the United States in 1901 about the status of U.S. territories acquired in the Spanish-American War, or since 1901. Some scholars also include others until 1979. The series constitute a paradox that condenses the pervasive and essential nature of the relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory that pertains to, but is not part of, the United States. One conclusion regarding Puerto Rico's territorial status is, according to Judge Juan Torruella, in a famous article published by Yale Law Review in 2013, is both cryptic and undecipherable. Near the end of his lengthy opinion, the judge proclaims that, while not a foreign country, Puerto Rico was foreign to the United States in a domestic sense. Go figure. Okay, my second it is no surprise that it was the same Supreme Court that decided in 1896 the case of Plessy versus Ferguson that legalized the Jim Crow rules that allow race segregation under another baffling doctrine, separate but equal. Even though the insular cases dealt mainly with commercial and trade matters, they have been used all along the 105 5 years of Puerto Rico's territoriality in political and civil rights decisions regarding the Puerto Ricans. This has been so even after our country entered in a supposedly new type of constitutional agreement with the US in 1958, and its name was eliminated from the United Nations list of colonies. At the core of the insular cases, racism, ethnicism, and national expediency, US national expediency, would dictate for most of this 125 years, and surely in the last decade, US policy making towards Puerto Rico. That's my remark for the third. I'm going to the fourth. I don't know how many minutes I have. 3 minutes. 3 minutes, okay. Aboard the US jailed General Nelson Miles, a veteran against Native American nations, cabled his superiors in Washington and anxious to proceed against the island of Puerto Rico. What he really wanted was to reach Ponce, which was the crown of the jewel in the island, I mean, economically speaking, okay? So Miles got there and said, he was received by the consular corps, which handled the negotiations with the invaders, and he says, Ponce and its forts, and you have a picture of that event, are now under in this exhibition, Ponce and its ports port are now under the American flag. The populace had received the troops and saluted our flag with frenzied enthusiasm. And that was true. 2 weeks afterward, Ramon B. Lopez, owner of a newspaper in San Juan, La Correspondencia, went there and he wrote a series of articles that were titled, Traveling to a Foreign Country. Hotels, shops, restaurants had changed their names to reflect the occupation. A well-known boarding house where he was staying was called now Hotel Washington instead of La Borinqueña. It did not surprise me, says Ramon B. Lopez. He would tell his readers, this is the trend. Everything must sound and taste American. And the last comment. In his book, Pitiyanquis of 1994, Edgardo Rodriguez Juliá, one of our most foremost writers, describes his family profile through the different paths taken by his paternal and maternal grandfathers during the invasion of 1898. American rule meant a loss of social prestige and economic well-being for his maternal white grandfather, who took refuge in nostalgia, but for his paternal grandfather, a mulatto house builder, the new regime was a life changer, an opportunity for a better future. In a very fluid terrain, the demise of an exhausted Spanish colonial regime and the arrival of the energetic new administration fostered a complex sequence of symbolic appropriations, negotiation, and adjustments regarding everyday life practices in the oldest colony of the world, still today. Thank you.
Aloha, mai kako. Let there be aloha among us. I'm going to take my time and see how much I can stress out Dr. LeMay. The story of Hawaii is a little bit different in that one could argue it was not a military takeover, but rather it was an inside job. And that story really starts in 1820 with the first missionaries from New England coming over and spreading Christianity, which had really been adopted by the royal family very, very quickly. And so as a result, the culture Christianized very, very quickly. And with that was a very strong struggle at a societal level on mores, because the traditional Hawaiian culture was much more liberal, shall we say. There was much intermarrying of the families, brothers and sisters, uncles and nieces, plural marriages, open marriages. It was all considered very good. You keep the mana close. You keep the family bloodlines tight so that the bloodlines can stay pure. That did not sit very well with the missionaries at all. Up to the point where even hula was considered to be very, very not okay. And was kapu. It was forbidden to openly practice hula. And it wasn't until Kalakaua and his coronation that started to reverse. So 1874, we have stories that when the coronation guide for Kalakaua in 1874 was being printed, hula was listed as one of the formal events that would happen. And the missionaries brought the case before the judges and actually had the printer arrested for spreading the salacious behavior. So you have this conflict of two completely different ideological views of what is okay and what's not. And that really started to come into play in about 1884 when the Missionary Party, which was a formal political party, started to get more and more seats in the legislature. They were very openly a pro-annexationist group. They made it very clear that they thought Hawaii should be part of the US because they're all descendants of these original missionaries. So they're all descendants of Americans. But yet they're all born in Hawaii. They identify as Hawaiian. They're Hawaiian citizens, but the households that they're raised in, the social structures that they run in are very, very pro-American. And up to and including, we'd be better off with Uncle Sam taking care of us. And you start to see that in a lot of the political cartoons that are coming out with the manifest destiny of, Uncle Sam caring for all these little savages, these little babies that need protecting and civilizing and, just raising them up proper like. And even though Hawaii had this incredibly rich, diverse, advanced culture, there was still that mentality of, well, we're just better and everybody should follow us. So with that 1884, the Missionary Party, or as it changed its name because missionaries started getting kind of a bad rep, they called themselves the Reform Party, started to get seats in the legislature. And so they started to push more for what they saw as highly conservative, traditional family values. Stop me if you've heard this lately. It's interesting how history repeats itself. George Santayana, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It's given the historian in me just nightmares at night because some of the rhetoric that we're hearing is exactly what we heard over 100 years ago. So with the increase of the control of this Reform Party, come 1887, they decided that the absolute monarchy, which they grew up with, was just no longer acceptable because these missionaries were some of the first to push for land ownership. Because when Kamehameha united the islands in 1810, he was absolute ruler of the Hawaiian Islands. He owned everything. The concept of land ownership was absolutely a Western influence. Because the king owned everything. The king could do what the king wanted. He was divinely chosen to lead the people and did that very quickly. And I'm just going to ignore Kate because we have lots of time left. And so you had this, we need checks on the office of the mo'i, the king, because he should not be able to run rampant. Because I have all of this land, I should be able to benefit from all of the efforts and energies my parents and I put into this. And part of the situation also was, Kalakaua, the King Kalakaua was a bit of a spendthrift. And the palace expenditures to build the Iolani Palace was exorbitant. And so some of these businessmen were worried about taxes going up, worrying about land seizures, because if the king could do anything he wanted, where was he going to get money to support a very high-end lifestyle? And so the bayonet constitution was forced upon the king. The fact that it's bayonet constitution should tell you about how fairly it was received. And it was backed by an independent militia of the Honolulu Rifles, 200 strong, which was about, the strongest military force on the island, under the control of the Reform Party. So they put these reforms upon the king, stating that you can veto, but then the legislature by 2/3 vote can override your veto. That your cabinet must have sway and influence on policy, and the legislature can remove any cabinet member for cause. They didn't say what cause, just cause. And so you saw this shift of power from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy. Well, when Liliuokalani steps up in 1891, she was raised in the royal family. She was a monarchist, she was an absolute monarchist, and wanted to institute her constitution that would give her back some of those powers that were taken away. And so the powers at be at the day, the Reform Party, the sugar plantation owners, the pineapple plantation owners, saw that as a direct threat to their ability to continue to get richer, get more power. And as a result, then they actually instituted the Overthrow of 1893. And we still see, even in big US media, talking about the US overthrow of the Hawaiian Islands. And the role that the US played was really through the counselor on site, John Stevens. The missionary party went to him and said, hey, we're really concerned about American citizens and American property. Can you land some troops from the Boston just to make sure that US life and liberty is protected? We don't want to see this native uprising and wind up, looting and burning and things of that nature. So on his own, Stevens landed 162 troops to protect the US legation, the US consulate, and Arion Hall, which just happened to be directly across the street from the palace. So the US involvement was this unauthorized landing of troops under Stevens. And it later came out when Cleveland came back to power. So President Cleveland was the only non-consecutive two-term president. In between him was Harrison, who was very much an expansionist, very much liked to see the US expand. Cleveland had met the Queen in 1887 when she was a princess on her way to England and entertained her at the White House, so had a formal relationship with the Hawaiian family. It was the policy of his administration that the Queen was the rightful ruler. During the Blount Report, which Cleveland ordered, it was found that the US had improperly influenced and supported the overthrow, and as a result, need to make amends. And so Cleveland wrote to the president of the Republic and said, you need to install the Queen. And the Republic said, go pound sand, you can't tell us what to do. And basically tried to wait out Cleveland until McKinley came in. And McKinley, knowing he was very expansionist, knowing that he needed a base in the Pacific, helped with the annexation. But the interesting thing is they had already negotiated a treaty with the Republic of Hawaii to annex. So the treaty of annexation went to Congress, was voted down. They needed 60 votes, they only got 43 votes. Because of the Kue petitions, which are upstairs on display, 21,000 Hawaiians signed a treaty against, petitions against annexation. The Queen was here in 1897, knowing Cleveland was running up his term, advocating for herself. And so as a result of that, we don't have this treaty, we have a resolution of Congress. And even to this day, there is this huge theme within Hawaii that we are under military occupation because there is no formal treaty. And my parting comments, as an archivist, this is very interesting as keepers of records because about once a quarter, I am accused of war crimes because I'm part of this machine. And so there is this huge undercurrent within the Hawaiian community about the legality of this overthrow and annexation that we still deal with over 100 years later.
Thank you to the panelists, and especially for being so timely. And I think we now have about 15 minutes, unless I'm told otherwise, for a Q&A. And should we take a few questions at a time or one by one? Is there a preference or? One by one? Okay. So any questions, please, if you want to refer to one of the speakers or to the panelists in general? I don't see any.
Are you asking them to go to the microphones, or are we bringing
yes.
the microphones to
Should
them?
they go to the microphones? Yes, please do. I see one person over there.
Good morning. I'm from the U.S. Virgin Islands. Just an interesting side note, the U.S. Virgin Islands was originally a Spanish colony. My question is for the professor from the University of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has always had a very active press, and I was just wondering what was being said in the press at that time, and also, what about the Puerto Ricans who had been educated in Europe and had returned to Puerto Rico? What was their role?
I couldn't understand the first part of your question.
Oh, the first person is just that I'm from St. Croix. That's all.
No, the role of the press in Puerto Rico. The response of the press to
During the
the.
invasion?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Oh, sorry. During the invasion, okay. The role of the press was censored by the Spanish authorities to say anything about the war since May, before the invasion. So there was little information, and only the official Gazette was printing that information that told about victories that were not occurring and that Spain was not giving up and so on, and patriotism all over the place. So it's very little what we know of the current initial days of the invasion through the press. But later on, the press starts to adjust and adapt, printing bilingual editions, and praising the U.S. And having their hopes put there, because they think that they will bring full democracy and full autonomy, which was enjoyed for a few months before the invasion, because Spain granted the autonomy in November 1897, just 6 months before the invasion. But the press is not a good source for information about the initial days. And you have to wait until things settled after October 1898, and then you have the conversion of mentalities through the press.
And the second question had to do with the return of people from Europe?
Yeah, the Puerto Ricans who had been educated in Europe and returned to Puerto Rico.
Well, that was a very, I'm not an expert on that subject, but it was very difficult for many people to be back because they were received as aliens because they were Spanish so-called citizens. So, and it was a military occupation for 2 years. So it was a very rough time for many that were far from the island. And they have to prove their citizenship. And we didn't enjoy any citizenship at all in the view of the U.S. We were like, I don't know, non-denominational for 2 years. And then in 1901, through the Foraker Act, we were named Puerto Rican citizens. Until 1917, after the war started, the intervention of the U.S. in the First World War, we became American citizens. Some people declined to be that and stayed as Spanish citizens.
Thank you. We have a few questions on this side, so.
My question is for Professor Ambeth Ocampo. Hello, my name is Eve Avila. I am from the Philippines. Last 4th of July, I was in the National Mall with my children watching the spectacular fireworks. And I heard them, they're about 30 years old, talking among each other. And they were sort of debating because some of them came from the school where you were teaching, the Ateneo de Manila University. And they were saying that, do you remember that the Independence Day of the Philippines used to be the 4th of July? And then something happened and it became June 12. So what's the real story there, Professor?
That was one of the things that troubles me today. Officially, it's June 12, 1898, when Emilio Aguinaldo declared independence. But then the problem there is the U.S. came in and took that independence from us. And so first, depending on where you are, from what vantage point you're looking at, it can be July 4, 1946 or June 12, 1898. Our main problem with that, how the change happened, was during the time of Diosdado Macapagal. He was supposed to come to the U.S. on a state visit, and he was going to ask for veterans' back pay and other things, and the U.S. did not give it to him, so he canceled the visit, and to make things more complicated, he decided by presidential fiat to move independence from July 4 to June 12. The excuse being that in diplomatic missions, nobody will attend the Philippine Independence Day if it's July 4, because everyone is in the U.S. Embassy. So that became one of the reasons. And so for historical reasons, and to go back to 1898, it has been June 12, 1898. But then that is always a big question.
Thank you.
Next question, please.
Hi, I have a question about Guam, especially looking at the topic mentioned of sustainability, because I was looking at the slide there, and the population and how much it grew in 100 years. So, sorry, I have many questions in mind. I'm going to try to formulate them clearly, but so before anything, how did it manage to grow so exponentially? How did the U.S. affect that growth? In what kind of way? And then as a last question, if, for example, like some of the military land, farm land that is used, were to be used to feed the citizens, the population of Guam that is not military, how would that also affect the sustainability?
Well, the population increase was, obviously it's not natural growth. I mean, Chamorros have big families, but this is beyond that. It was a large immigration, initially for labor, for the construction projects, a large military influx. Today, the population, the native population is maybe 37, 38%. So actually since 1980, the Chamorros have no longer been the majority. So it's a very multi-ethnic community. It's a high percentage of people who come to Guam for jobs, really, especially because there's a large military presence. Yeah, the issue with the military land, I mean, it's land on Guam is a big issue because there's so little of it, and it's really our primary resource. But it's, also the military lands that have been returned, they're not returning pristine land. And I'll give you an example. One of my students was telling me that in her mother's family, there's 9 brothers and sisters. 1 has passed away, but all the other 8 have cancer. And they're saying maybe the 9th had cancer too, maybe that's why she died. So just a couple days, and she told me where she lives. And just a couple days ago, I saw something in the newspaper. The Army, the Air Force is asking for families if we can survey the land to see if there's any unexploded munitions there. So I sent a WhatsApp to her, like, is this where your family lives? And she said, oh, yeah. And I'm like, so, some of the families that did get their land returned, and they're living on that land, they're living on top of lands that have all kinds of problems, but, there hasn't been a proper cleanup. So there's always pressure for the military to return land when it declares it excess. And there are processes for people who used to own that land to gain leases to them. But there's a Chamorro Land Trust, and it's just got a lot of problems because these, the lands themselves are unsurveyed, and But anyone who gets a lease to those lands has to do some farming on them. That's part of the provision to get control of the land. I mean, there's a lot of attempts to do small-scale farming, and people are trying to do it, but it's mainly import substitution. So, because 90% of our food is imported, but if we can start at least growing our own, eggplants and things we can, bananas, et cetera. So it's not necessarily that much commercial farming. It's mainly more trying to get more subsistence farming going, which is very important, right? So a lot of my students are young activists, and I tell them, what you want to do is you want to be teaching people at the rallies, how to plant banana trees, and even if you live in an apartment, have some like little cherry tomato plants, and because once you start being able to feed yourself, even if it's a little bit, at least psychologically you're empowering yourself, right? So part of the indigenous rights groups, the youngsters, what I'm talking about, 20-year-olds, the 20, 30-year-olds, I think a lot of them are also turning their attention to sustainability, and it's as small scale as they can, but it's an important step, right? Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, please.
It better be for me, because I'm the only one who hasn't had one yet.
Actually, it's for everyone.
We'll start with you.
Yes. So, as has been made very clear here, the War of 1898 is a war, is a moment of silences and erasures, and encapsulating this moment as 1898, the War of 1898 emphasizes U.S. dominant overseas expansionism. While rendering the point of view of the local people and the local experience invisible. So my question is, how, and I know this is a huge question, how would each of you think that we could reframe this common history and decolonize this label of the War of 1898?
So Adam?
Well, I'll start with that. As an archivist, I have some very strong views on that. And that's to stop interpreting history. It's not my job to tell people their history. It's my job to connect them to the original primary sources so they can read the words of those who shaped that history themselves. And then through their world lens, interpret it on how it has impacted them. So it's stop doing that completely and make these resources available at the core level.
But part of the problem is that the resources, for example, on Guam, the resources we have access to are really colonial documents. We don't have a body of native documents. And so the story is continually told from this framework that America is a rising empire, Spain is a declining empire. Woohoo, lucky us, we're now on the American empire, we're on the way up now. It's been difficult to get a story beyond that, and given Guam's still a colony, and we were, run under martial law all the way until 1950 when we got citizenship, and we had no status as, not even as nationals. People who tried to apply for citizenship weren't given citizenship because the United States was saying you are not a citizen of another nation, so there's no citizenship to renounce. So it was a very ambiguous status. So but anyway, yeah. So it's just hard to get at any kind of documentation to give the kind of native perspective. The ones you'll mostly get will be pro-U.S.
For the Philippines, there's too much documentation. Historians always complain when there's too little and also when there's too many. But I'd like to, it was something I forgot to say earlier, but when we look at this period and we look at the Philippines, and this comment I want to leave you with, it's summed up very well by the late Carmen Guerrero Nakpil, who described the Philippines as a country that spent 400 years in a convent and 50 years in Hollywood. So when you think about that and you think about the way in which we go back, present and represent that history, we have to see both that 400 years of Spain, which was erased from us in 50 years of American occupation. So I've been looking at early textbooks, American textbooks, and it shows how they are reframing the American presence as like coming out like a savior. So you have books like, this will give you, the students, a correct history so much against the biased, religious, backward Spanish sources. No? So it's high time, actually, this generation, that we are actually giving a more nuanced view about the colonial periods, not just the US, but also the Spanish period, and coming to terms with that past and understanding not only the past, but ourselves in the present as we move on into the future.
Alfred Mahan, the geopolitical guru for the McKinley administration, said that Puerto Rico and all the other islands did not have history. Islands without history was his concept. Well, it wasn't so. And 400 years of Spanish domination and the progressive identity building of some sort, a very complex process, was underway and is still underway. And our stories are not being told as we would like, but there are sources, there is archival material, and since I would say 40 years from, we have been discovering many things that were there, but we were not reading it or learning from it because of the school system and so on. And it's a thing of rediscovery, not reinterpretation, but it's rediscovery.
So with the one last minute, I'm going to jump in and steal this time for the people of Lahaina. The Maui fires can in some ways be attributed to this whole concept that we're discussing here. There's some serious talk about, during the firefighting effort on the fire in Lahaina, water rights became a very serious issue. From these huge plantations that grew up, particularly with annexation, they own all the water on Maui. So getting access to that water requires them to release their rights in that water. And so there was some talk of the firefighters didn't have enough water to fight the fire. Whether that's true or not, the fact that that mechanism is still in place shows the problems that we are experiencing today, again, 120 years after the wars.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more, no more time. So we're gonna close the session. Thank you to all our speakers.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Jorge Duany, for moderating this really important introduction to this vast history that's very overwhelming. As you can see, we have ASL interpretation, and right now I welcome you to follow myself or Taina to the 1898 galleries. We are offering gallery talks beginning at 11:30 and going until 12:30. So you have 7 options. There's going to be 7 speakers. And what we expect is that people will self-select into groups. We do have a lot of volunteers to help you find the group that you want to go to. And the gallery talks are 10 minutes each with 8 minutes of lecture and 2 minutes for Q&A. I think that's it that I need to say. So we have Shamika and Ashley for ASL. If you are interested in ASL interpretation, please find them. And meanwhile, feel free to follow Taina and me up to the 1898 galleries.